Socialism in general has a record of failure so blatant that it takes an intellectual to ignore or evade it. Those are the wise words from Thomas Sowell, and I was thinking of them when I finished this book. This is The Shortest History of the Soviet Union by Shiela Fitzpatrick, a fantastic book. I've read a surprising number of histories of the Soviet Union. I'm really interested in Russia and its history, and the Soviet Union is one gigantic experiment that occurred in the 20th century. I want to share why it's so important to be aware of the pros and cons of socialism, because right now we find in the West in particular a resurgence of popularity in regards to socialism. And it is important to inoculate ourselves against that, because the younger generations in general are in favor of this. It's over half of Gen Zs view socialism in a very positive light in the US, and that is a really concerning figure. There are three things that I think the Soviet Union got right, and the first one is that they understood the power of language and they used it to their advantage. So Lenin was the main driving force for this in the early days of the revolution that occurred in Russia, and he changed the name, or named his group the Bolsheviks, and the opposing socialist group the Mensheviks. So the Bolsheviks implied the majority or the largest group, and the Mensheviks was the minority, the smallest group. And yet the reality was the exact opposite. The Bolsheviks were actually the smallest group. They were the minority group in that entire revolution. And the use of that language, really, it's kind of a case of fake it until you make it. And eventually the Bolsheviks became the Bolsheviks, the majority, and they really won out in the end. The power of language, we must keep that in mind, because language is used against us today. A good example would be during the pandemic, when a whole new slate of words just entered our vocabulary and people absorbed them and accepted them, and it changed their behavior. New norm, stay safe, became the favorite way of saying goodbye to someone, wishing them well, stay safe. No one really considered what that meant so much. No one really argued whether or not that's actually something that is an admirable thing to wish for someone else. Do you really wish that someone will stay safe, or do you want them to go out and have the greatest time of their life, the greatest adventure of their life? I think in general we don't think too deeply on these things, but those words just slipped in to our vocabulary, and still to this day we're using them, and it has had, in my opinion, a controlling effect on populations around the world. Language is powerful, so be conscious of that. The Soviets understood that very well, and they used it to their advantage. The second point is that they understood that you need to unify people by giving them a common enemy to rally against. And this changed from time to time throughout different phases of the leadership within the Soviet Union. In the early days, it was against the bourgeoisie, it was against the royalty, it was against anyone who wasn't the proletariat. It was against the kulaks. A kulak was anyone who was doing better than the worst in society in the villages, and they were basically run out. They were the people who had one more cow than everyone else. They were the people who envy and jealousy was unleashed against. And then it was the Jews at another point. It was the wreckers, those who were supposedly sabotaging the growth of the Soviet Union. It could just be someone who made a mistake, but they would be deemed a wrecker. And then it was the Nazis, and then you had the capitalist pigs, the Americans, and during the Cold War. And every single time you had to have someone to rally against. And I share this because it's still being done to this day in the West. We have enemies, we have people that we have to rally against. And that is an attempt at kind of unifying at least the focus or the fear of the population to move in a certain direction. So pay attention if that's ever being used against you, and see if you can walk the opposite direction. That is a difficult thing to do when your entire country is moving in one direction, and that is off a cliff. And that is why this channel exists, because in general the West is heading in that direction, And so it makes sense to turn the opposite way and look for other alternatives. And the final thing that the Soviet Union did well, that they got right, was that they unleashed the worst part of people into the world. So in order for a socialist country to really flourish or to come into existence, and to sustain itself, it needs to operate on envy, jealousy, and fear. Kind of the worst parts of human beings need to be brought to the fore. And I really saw that happen, at least here in Australia, as the worst parts of humanity were appealed to by the leaders of the country, rather than leaders of the country standing up and setting an example of strength and courage and a stoic philosophy towards moving on despite the inevitable struggles and difficulties of life. We had the opposite. We had envy or jealousy or fear of your neighbor, particularly a lot of fear. It was be afraid, be very afraid, and go and stay in your home. And this is a very dangerous rhetoric, but it's something that the Soviet Union got right for a very long time. They were very good at doing that. But ultimately, it is a self-sacrificing rhetoric because it will turn on you. It cannot flourish forever. So inevitably, Soviet and socialist communities and experiments will collapse in on themselves because they appeal to the worst part of ourselves while using words that sound very flowery, that sound like they're appealing to the best in ourselves. Redistribution of things that are not yours is never going to be appealing to the best part of yourself, even if you use the most flattering and appealing words. So those are the three things that I think the Soviet Union did really well. And if you want to learn more about it, I encourage you to get this book because it is really worthwhile to have a refresher on that great horror story that was the Soviet Union throughout the 20th century. And then there are other great books like In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park about the ongoing horror story of the North Korean experiment that is continuing to this very day. And there are many, many other examples around the world. So this is an unusual episode of Exit West, but I think it's something that is worthwhile talking about. If you found it interesting, you'd like more content like this, just give it a thumbs up, leave me a comment below and let me know. If not, that's okay. I will be doing more country reviews in regards to residencies and how to set up residencies and looking at the options that are out there, because I believe there are no perfect places out there, but there could be somewhere that is perfectly suited for you. Let's find it together.